we'll go through the posterior oblique subsystem and exercises for that, and then the anterior oblique subsystem, and some exercises for that as well today. And then next week we'll get into our lateral and longitudinal subsystems, and we'll talk about how they interact with each other. But let's go ahead and dive right into our posterior oblique subsystem. That's going to be this top diagram, and we have in there our glute max, our lats, and the I missed the erectors do work with that, and the thoracolumbar fascia. So we have our glutes here. It's right inside the hip. This is the top of the hip there. And then we have our lat muscle. This is that big muscle that runs down from the armpit into the back. And then these are our erectors up here, and they run up to the ribs. They help us stand nice and upright. And what we have is this angle running this direction. You can see how these muscles are oriented, where they have like this cross pull, and they're on this slope because they interact with each other and they help us rotate, and it almost forms like a little bit of an X. So I put this X here in the middle, and they pull towards each other. So like when we're taking a step forward and we have the arm go back and we have the leg go back at the same time, I'm in this position, I'm going to have that contraction happen from here across to here, and then on the front side we'll have a contraction going across the front. So it's really important that we have a good relationship in this subsystem. So if I say we're not using this glute really well, then it's probably going to have an impact on this lat too, because it crosses over the spine. So we'll get into some exercises in just a second for that, and then we're going to go ahead into this anterior oblique subsystem. I have to hold this up. It's a little low. So right here we have our external obliques, and then we have our internal obliques, and then we have our adductor, or our inner thigh muscle. I'm just going to lift this up to make sure everybody can see it. So with that, you can look at the way these lines are oriented, and you can see that this external oblique slopes this direction, internal oblique kind of slopes the same way, and then we have the adductor, which also kind of slopes the same way if you look at it in comparison to our external oblique. And these tissues are all going to interact to help keep the pelvis upright. Adductor keeps the femur from kicking out to the side too much, and this all allows us to work in the transverse plane or the rotational plane. And what we want to get out of these muscles is interaction, right? That they're working well with each other and allowing movement to happen on the opposite side. So just like when we have that step forward and we're driving one arm back, one leg back, and we have this contracting, well, when we have one leg going forward and one arm going forward, it's going to be the same thing on the front side. So that's the anterior oblique sling. And some people will even say that serratus is involved. I did draw like a little area for our serratus, that rib muscle, those gills, if you will, coming across the ribs there. And they will say when they are dissecting these that it's really hard to distinguish between the external obliques and the serratus, where they meet and where they overlap with each other and align. When they're going through with the scalpel, they have a hard time sometimes distinguishing the two at like the meshing area where they intersect. So some people say they fit into the anterior oblique sling. Some people don't, and that's still up for research. but we do know that the rib muscle does interact with the core, and we do know that that rib muscle provides us tremendous shoulder stability. So we'll remain mindful of it, and I'd like to think that it interacts with this sling personally, just from my own experience and the way I feel my own body. So we'll go ahead and dive into some exercises for this. And we'll start off with our posterior oblique sling. We'll work some exercises for that. And then we'll go ahead into our anterior oblique sling. So first one for the posterior oblique sling, it's a real simple one. It's the bird dog. It's a great core exercise, and it's going to challenge our opposite muscle groups here. So we'll start off kneeling, and then we're bracing through the core. This is a great starter exercise, a good warm-up exercise. And then we're going to just drive and extend, and I'm squeezing my right glute and my left shoulder to lift my arm up overhead. And that's going to help me challenge that posterior oblique subsystem, working through that area. You get a nice exhale as we extend out. And you can work alternating as well. It's going to be a little bit more coordination involved, but it's a great go for this. Once you've gotten your motion down, you're able to sense your core through that position. Bird dog is a great exercise to challenge posterior oblique subsystem. Single leg with the one arm cobra is another great exercise. So what we'll do is we'll get into a single leg stance, and then we're going to lift this leg off the ground, bracing through the core, and we're going to just drive that opposite arm back. So I'm contracting my right shoulder with my left hip. I'm just going to work through, good stabilizing. We're going to have to work through the core on the front side to help support that, but we're going to be actively contracting through our posterior oblique subsystem, getting that right side going, along with the stability in that hip. And then we'll move into a row with rotation. This is a great one to get both side obliques really going. I like to think about when we're rotating, so we're twisting, we're going to have external obliques helping us twist to the opposite side, and then internal obliques are going to help twist to the same side. So both obliques are going to be working in rotation. So like if you twist one way and you have a hard time feeling it, then I would think about, well, which direction am I twisting, what am I not feeling, and try to break it down and figure out what is it that you're not feeling. Is it your internal obliques or your external obliques? And that's an interesting thing to start to figure out for yourself. If you notice that one of them isn't firing really well, and once you get that figured out, then it's going to help this whole subsystem work better and ultimately make you move better. So for this action, we're going to get both slings really working here. So I'm going to brace through my hips, and then I'm going to row and twist and pull back. So as I do that, I'm contracting through here, and I'm going to feel that in my right glute if I'm holding tension there pretty well. And then I'm going to try to stay nice and tall here, and then just working through thoracic rotation. So we're just twisting the ribs around the spine here. Getting the spine to rotate with that. And then we're working those side abs, and we're working through that posterior oblique sling. This is a great exercise to get those obliques going, and also to work that backside sling. And then we'll go one more on the posterior sling here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up ankle cuff to my leg, and then I'm also going to be rowing with my opposite side. So we're going to work through that backside sling one more time. This is a little bit more of a challenging exercise. Once you've developed some like stability and you have some of that sensory awareness going, definitely a great exercise to get into. What we'll do is lift up into hip flexion, and then I have my opposites out in front. My right leg's out in front, my left arm's out in front. I'm nice and tall through the core, and then I'm going to pull both back simultaneously. Squeezing in my right glute to drive that leg back, right hamstring to drive that back, and my left shoulder I'm going to be working through the lats back there, working through the rhomboids. And some people will say rhomboids exist in the posterior oblique subsystem. I could see that. There's still research for that to be done. But we are going to be working that simultaneously as we row and extend that leg out back. Real big squeeze. And you can pause and just feel all that stuff contract as well. You can really feel that line going off if we're working through there well and we're holding good integrity through our core, so we're nice and upright and giving ourselves the ability to feel all that. Then we're going to go ahead into the anterior oblique subsystem. So this is going to be more like what people think of the core. Posterior oblique subsystem in my mind is definitely a part of the core. It's this whole middle housing. But when people think core, they think abs. So this is going to be more of like what you think of when you see ab exercises or when you think in that direction. We're going to start with a modified half curl up. This is a great exercise for starters to start feeling this. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to go with one leg bent, and then we're going to think about keeping this nice and compressed together. So I'm tucking my pelvis up, drawing my belly button back, and then I'm thinking just pull my shoulders off the ground with a big exhale, and then I'm going to lower back down. We get a little pause, and what this offset position does is it kind of encourages this cross pull. So this adductor is a little bit shortened. That inner thigh muscle is not as long or is in a lengthened position as it would be here. Just shortening out this tissue a little bit, and then it's lifting up, and that's going to be that contraction across, right? And we can start to work with a little bit of rotation there. It's not a bad thing. But a lot of times I'll just start this simple squeeze, lift the shoulders up. We're going to be mindful not to lift with the neck. We don't want to put a lot of strain on the neck here. It's like we're almost like rolling our ribs down and rolling the shoulders off the ground with that, and the head comes up as a result. So we don't want to lift with the neck there. Definitely not how we want to approach that. The second one I like is a dead bug. This is another good exercise, getting you going. Might be a little advanced for some folks. It's a good intermediate exercise here. I still like to use these quite a bit as a warm-up or variations of it. But what we'll do is we're going to drive the knees up into the ball, drive the hands down into the ball, and then we're going to lower opposites down. So on the lowering side, I'm actually going to be working through my posterior oblique subsystems. I'm working through the back and the back of the leg on this leg. And then on the front side, this hand is driving down and this leg is driving up. So I'm going to get this cross pull from this shoulder up to this hip, right, as I'm driving there. So it's creating that tension line through the anterior oblique subsystem. Then just working, oh, I messed up, working those opposites here. One thing I'll say, when you are working on opposites, whether you're doing a gait-specific exercise or you're doing a drill that just requires you to move your opposite arm with your opposite leg, for whatever reason, when we start to think about it, it gets a little tricky. But if you go out and start walking and you just take note of it, you're going to be working through like that rotational component, working those opposite limbs going forward. Naturally we do it, but when we're training, we want to like emphasize that so we can strengthen that connection from the shoulder to the hip. And sometimes in that thought process, it gets us. Definitely gets me. Let's see. The next one we're going to go ahead into is our split stance cylinder rotation. This is a great exercise. Once you're already gotten some coordination going and you want to continue to challenge your obliques, we'll get into a split stance here. So I'm going to make sure my outside leg is out in front, and that's going to help me bring this across. So I'm bringing my shoulder across this way and kind of connecting this line again. So as I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and just pull across and then back through. Big exhale as I squeeze through. And then it just depends on what phase of training you're in and your experience level, and like how many reps you would do per side. You know, I could give you like 10 to 15 be a good place. It just depends on what you're looking to get out of it, really. Yep, so split stance with the cable machine is great. We will think about just making sure that we're in a position that's going to really make sure that we're working that sling, right? Because if I'm this way, I might not be working the sling the same way because this leg is back. So that would be like just my one thought with that. So I would rather come across this way so I can bring this connection here. And then if you think about it on the back side, if I'm coming across this way, contracting through here, and then I'll be connecting this sling, the posterior oblique sling, as I pull into that position. So making sure that we have that split stance where you're pulling across towards the lead leg, that's the side I would favor there. And then a single leg chop is a great one to do as well. So I'm going to slide this up to the top here. And I like to do this again with that outside leg being the one that we're twisting towards. So I'm going to lift that up. And this is going to be a little bit more challenging here because we're balancing on one leg. So I'll go with a lighter resistance on the line and then just pulling across. And it's the same idea. Bringing that shoulder towards the hip and trying to keep this as steady as you can while working through that cross pull, stabilizing on the one leg, working through those obliques, and setting yourself up in a position. Like if this is challenging and it's too much as it is to go with your split stance on the cable machine or you're working with bands, I would leave the single leg chop alone until I get a little bit more proficient in the split stance. And then I'm pretty good there. I might go ahead and challenge you a little bit more in a single leg stance and work that way. That's usually the progression. And then we're going to throw in our press with rotation. So this is going to go into the obliques again, getting those side abs. Definitely want to feel serratus working as we go through this exercise. So that rib muscle definitely is going to be working here. And what we'll do is we'll start in our neutral stance, feet about hip width apart. We're standing nice and tall. We're tucked at the pelvis. So we're nice and engaged here through the midsection. And then we'll do this just like we did with the row and rotation. We're going to press and then pull the other arm back and get a good amount of rotation through thoracic spine. And just work in that twist. And I like to actively think about pulling this arm back because that's going to help me get this twist here as I reach my other arm forward. Get a nice twist through thoracic spine, trying to keep the hips forward. One thing that works well when people are just learning this exercise, take a foam roller, take a pillow, maybe even a little like kickball or something that you can squeeze And then you can tell if you're shifting through your hips. So if you're wobbling side to side, you'll feel that foam roller moving, and then we just work through, trying to keep a good squeeze through the adductors. So remember, the adductors are a part of this system, so if we can get them engaged, that's going to help us out anyways. So like, even if you don't have a hard time feeling this and keeping steady, you'll be able to feel your inner thighs working a little bit more if you give yourself a little prop there. Post that up right in between the thighs, and then you'll get that squeeze. And there's some of my favorite exercises to go through. I'm just going to pull this back out to run through it. So when we're thinking about this, we're never working just one muscle at a time, and we're really never just working one sling either. So like, if this is contracting and this side's pulling back, then on the opposite side, so like if this is left shoulder to right hips contracting, then right shoulder to left hip is going to be contracting and pulling in the front side, right? So anterior sling is going to work with the posterior sling, and they work with each other, but they also have to let each other do their job. So like, if this shoulder is really tight, right, my left shoulder is really tight, then when this left shoulder wants to come forward, it's just not going to want to do it. It's not going to have the same freedom to do it. So, you know, to breaking things down with the assessment, we like to assess and see how the slings interact through watching either gait, or we can do other assessments, working on just like how you can contract them laying on the ground, and just seeing how well they work and trying to figure out where that limitation is, and we can start to dive into that a little bit more. Once we get that freed up, we have more available range of motion, we have more motor control and sensory going from the tissue to the brain, from the brain to the tissue, controlling that. Being able to harness that control, it just enables us to walk better, run better, do just about everything better. Everything that we do pretty much is going to have something to do with the sling. Everything. You know, it's a really key player in this. The other subsystems definitely are going to be involved as well, and we're going to get into that some more next week. But want to kind of get this narrowed down, because everybody talks about being stronger through the core. You know, if my core was stronger, you know, my back's weak. You hear those terms thrown out there. But what it is a lot of times to me is the coordination, right? It's like, how do you quantify like how strong your core is? Because you can do like a 60-pound like crunch on like a cable machine. You know, like you could throw a number there, but like, is that actually going to help this rotation? And sometimes I find people who want to be able to put a quantifiable number to this, and it's a really hard thing to do, frankly, because it's coordination, and it's hard to like put an exact number on it. But when you can sense it, right? The sensory is more of what I care about, especially when we're talking about this stuff. You know, like, it's great to get heavier lifts and get stronger. I love that stuff. But when we're talking about core, how that works, I think of coordination. I think of motor control. I think of how well are we using these slings, as opposed to like how much resistance can it handle. Because like, if it can't handle like some resistance with little resistance and go through like a motor control pattern, then it doesn't matter. And you're right, Paul. A lot of people do equate core exercises, sit-ups, and crunches, and you know, they're a part of it. So like, when we're working those exercises, I didn't put these on the diagram, but that's gonna work just this middle line and like out to here basically, and it's just gonna be this little segment right in the middle. That's all we get from these exercises. So thinking about like a six-pack, that's the squeeze that you'll get when you do that. But does that necessarily mean you'll get a six-pack? Maybe not. The reality is, though, if we're using more of this tissue, the side parts, we're going to create more filled out tissue, which is going to be more distinguished, and it will give us a more aesthetically pleasing look versus doing a million crunches. Because like a million crunches is just working that midsection, and we're not getting any of this stuff out here. And in reality, like, this is the stuff that helps us the most. You know, our obliques, our side abs, they connect down to the pelvis. They help hold the pelvis up. So, you know, if you have like a shift happening and you're walking and your hips are shifting side to side, you know, you're not going to get a lot of benefit from doing crunches versus like teaching this side part of your obliques to hold this pelvis up and not let that drop down when I take a step or when I climb stairs. Not having that shift happen is going to make your back feel better. It's going to take stress off your spine. And it's going to make your core work the way it's supposed to, what it was designed to do. And there's a lot of things that come along with crunches and sit-ups. And I'm not like completely opposed to them. I think they have their place in time and in a program. But that's where you kind of get into the nitty-gritty of like what needs it the most of training. You know, like if you're not good at flexing your abs and you're not good at going this direction, then let's do it. You know, but for the most part, I feel like a lot of people are already sitting in their desk. They're already here. These muscles are already flexed. They need to learn how to lengthen, and then they need to learn how to contract that lengthened area. But that's just a fraction of what our core is really about. And I would argue that most of what our core is really about is coordinating the ability to walk and to walk without being rigid. So like you see people who are like really big and they're really strong and they have a lack of rotation. And you'll see these guys walking around and there's nothing wrong with them, but they don't have as much range and they kind of walk and they don't really get a lot of twisting action. A lot of times they're going to be slightly turned out and they have like a bit of a waddle going on and they don't have good rotation happening, and they just don't have the same neuromuscular control through that area. They're not getting that same action out of it. And you know, there's not anything really wrong with that, but if it's causing you pain, you know, that's where I would say that's an issue. You know, I don't really say anybody's wrong in terms of like how they're training if that's what they want to train for. I think we should all have a purpose in what we're training for, but it's if it causes limitations that cause irritation, then we need to address that, because we do have the bodily function to make that connection happen and eliminate that, right? And we can get that rotation back. We can teach that neural pathway, and we can get that coordination where you can walk and rotate and you can still lift heavy. And that's a fun thing. You know, if you have the coordination and you have the strength that you desire, that's great. And if you don't really desire to be super strong, that's totally fine too. But to be coordinated is the goal, right? That's, you know, if you're coordinated, you'll be able to move more, you'll be able to produce more force, and it certainly does help with posture because we're going to be using more of those tissues, right? And if we're thinking about on here, Paul, with our erectors, they're going to be helping hold us more upright on this side. So these are the lats, these are the erectors on this side. So they're going to help us stay more steady and stay taller through our walking posture as well. So it certainly does help us out with that. And same thing with the front side. If we're working through our obliques, we will have to be a little bit more opened up. We can't be crunched down because this is going to inhibit some of this action, right? So we have to be able to get to a better posture, and that's why I usually will start with like core exercises off the floor, kind of help you learn how to feel it without some of the ground forces of standing up, and then take it to a standing position and start to mess around with that split stance, single leg, and kind of just continue to develop that coordination. And you know, anytime in your training you might have to revisit, you know, the floor exercises and go back to that, or start with those just to get that movement prep. If you've been sitting for, you know, a long time and you're having a hard time feeling something, it might be easier to just go to the floor, get that sensory, go back to standing, and then continue with your workout. That's usually how I like to approach it, and to program that in a developmental fashion, so we can make improvements not just in our loads that we can manage, but also make improvements in our coordination and developing that out, because that's the biggest thing I find for people, is they have an injury that knocks them off course and they lose coordination from the trauma, or, you know, they're in a bad posture all day from sitting, and that throws them off course, and they lose that same movement function. You know, it's not the same trauma that the tissue experienced, but it's the stuck position where that tissue just gets a little stuck from sitting. So definitely a great posture thing. Let's see, do we have any other questions today? Great questions, Paul. Awesome. So, like I said, next week we're going to get into the deep longitudinal subsystem and the lateral subsystem, and we'll get into that a little bit more. The posterior oblique subsystem and the lateral subsystem, they have muscles that are like in both of them, and they connect quite a bit actually, and we'll talk more about that and ways we can challenge that, and then we'll get into that deep longitudinal system as well. That actually has tissue that runs over into the posterior oblique subsystem as well, through the thoracolumbar fascia, like the low back area into the middle of the back. That tissue all kind of joins up, and we'll get more into that next week, and we'll dive into exercises to challenge that subsystem and how that all integrates together. Alrighty. Well, I thank you all for your time. Appreciate everybody stopping by, and we'll be back here next week, 12:30. See you then.